what we consider real art is a movie that does not have a safety net. Godfather 1 did not have a safety net. Godfather 2 did not have a safety net. Apocalypse Now did not have a safety net. It was made on its own terms. It didn't also have a few dozen car crashes and whatever the formula is, that is the safety net. The Godfather? Well, it's sort of astonishment that 50 years have gone by. A lot of these memories are still pretty vivid in my mind. I was about 29 when I began preparing The Godfather, and in the course of the years involved in making it and editing it, I guess I was in my very early 30s. Nothing about what my life was like remained the same after The Godfather. Certainly that film changed everything for me.
But let's be frank, you never wanted my friendship. And you were afraid to be in my debt.
I didn't want to get into trouble.
I understand.
I could easily be described as penniless before I made the film. My father was a musician, so my childhood was pretty much raised in the shadow of my father's career, and we all wanted him to get his big break. My brother wanted to be a novelist, and I wanted to be the junior version of whatever my brother was. So all this ultimately leads to me getting involved in theater, and then from theater I became involved as a UCLA film student, partly because my brother had gone to UCLA. Ultimately, nothing was to prepare to the experience of The Godfather. Number one, it was a terrible experience. I was always on the verge of about to get fired, and a lot of my choices were immediately discarded. I wanted Al Pacino to play the character Michael, and they said that's ridiculous. No one's ever heard of him. And I wanted Marlon Brando to be the now famous Don Corleone, and they said, oh, he's a lot of trouble, and no one's going to see his films anymore. I wanted to make it in New York. They said, you can't make it in New York, it's too expensive. I wanted to make it set in 1945, the way the book was. They said, it's ridiculous, you can't do it, you can't have it, you can't do it. And this is a terrible movie, to the point where at least 4 occasions I came that close to getting fired. And then, surprise was surprise, it turns out to be this gigantic success, and suddenly I became this famous person, which in itself is also another thing to deal with. So I have to say to you that the 50 years ago, having made The Godfather, definitely changed my life in many, many ways for the better, but certainly in many also confusing ways in terms of my relationship with my idol, who was my brother, and my father, who I did have the pleasure of standing next to when he won an Oscar for the second Godfather. That was a real thrill. So all I can say to you is it was interesting.
And I refused to be a fool. Dancing on the string held by all those big shots. I don't apologize, that's my life, but I thought that when it was your time, that you would be the one to hold the strings.
In school, I had learned the technique of sort of outwitting the faculty. The faculty controlled everything in theater school. They got a kick out of my being rebellious and my competition with them and controlling the productions I did in school. But that was where I learned how to deal with the studios and trying to figure out how, even with no power, which a young filmmaker has zero power, that I could still, through bluff and misdirection, and to get my way. And I guess that's how I got my way in The Godfather and got Pacino to be in it and got the look I wanted. It was more expensive to make The Godfather as a period picture than what they had wanted, which was to make it be set in 1973, which is when it was being made. But I credit those victories not to any, I certainly had no clout, but I had a certain degree of skill in outwitting the people supervising you and the tremendous talent of the people I was working with on The Godfather. The photographer, Gordon Willis, the production designer, Dean Tavaleras, the costume designer, Johnny Johnson, and that extraordinary cast, Al Pacino, Jimmy Caan, Robert Duvall, Johnny Casal, Al Letteri, Marlon Brando, Diane Keaton, on, and not to mention the writer, Mario Puzo, who had written the story and the characters. With such people to work with is the only way you can explain The Godfather that we now know as a classic.
But if Clemenza can figure a way to have a weapon planted there for me, then I'll kill them both.
I didn't know anything about what we called the mafia, or Cosa Nostra, but neither did Mario know anything about it. He did everything by research. He read the Fallaci papers, and of course a lot has been written about the story of the Italian gangster in New York, the so-called Five Families and what happened. So my feeling was that even though I knew nothing about it, I had never met a real mafioso. My family were all musicians or tool and die makers. But one thing we were an Italian-American family. So the home, what we had at the dinner table, the way the men related to the women, the way the children were at the wedding, running around the sandwich. The fact that Italian weddings were sandwiches thrown, wrapped in paper, and all of those traditions and sensibilities were in my blood because I was an Italian-American kid raised in New York at a time when it wasn't even cool to be an Italian. My feeling was that I could give the movie authenticity about how Italian Americans live. I couldn't give them any other authenticity, but I did work very hard to study and try to take out of the novel what I thought was in there, which was, despite all of the potboiler stuff, there was in there sort of the latent idea of a classical, almost Shakespearean story about a great king who had three sons and needed to choose one to succeed him. So I think it was that political analysis and story of power and its succession that made the film more weighty and more interesting. The Godfather Part II. When the time came for there to be a second Godfather, they wanted a second Godfather. I thought it was an absurd idea. The Godfather was complete. After The Godfather, I knew how to make that type of Italian-American gangster film, but I didn't want to do it again. I wanted to do something, because if you make films you don't know how to make, you learn a lot. If you make films you do know how to make, you maybe will make more money, but you basically don't learn as much. So I was more curious on going on into different forms and make more movies I didn't know how to make, which certainly was Apocalypse Now and all the others. They basically wanted me to make another Godfather because they'd been so successful. And finally, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. After I did try to say, I'll write it and I'll supervise it, but I want to pick a new young director to direct it, and had one in mind, and they just said, no, absolutely not. We won't trust this to some new young guy, which they had trusted it to me, so that didn't make any sense. But eventually, when they said that I could do anything I want and I wouldn't have to kowtow to their structure and have them read my script and give me their notes, which I said I wouldn't do, and could call the movie The Godfather Part II, which was, there was more pushback on the title than even the ridiculous amount of money I asked them for, which they didn't seem to care, but they rejected the idea as a title, saying people would think it was the second half of the movie they'd already seen. I said, well, that was it. I would do it or I wouldn't do it. And that brought a whole eternity of Part 2s and Part 3s and Part 4s, which if I had known that would happen, I wouldn't have done it. At any rate, I got to make that, and I just used the story that I was interested in. You know, you can always understand the son by the story of his father. I mean, you take Rupert Murdoch. He was a kid in Australia whose father ran a big newspaper, and he used to take his son to see it. Or Ted Turner was involved with a father that was basically a salesman of billboard ads, and out of his interest in his father, he went on. So the story of the father is always embedded in the son. If you're interested in the subject, you read one of the earliest Persian books called Shah-Nahamah, the story of kings, and it's all about the fathers and the sons of the first kings of Persia. And the son never betrays the father. The father always betrays the son.
I'll do business with you, but the fact is that I despise your masquerade. The dishonest way you pose yourself and your whole fucking family. Senator, we're both part of the same hypocrisy. But never think it applies to my family.
Godfather 2, when you think about it, was a much more complex picture than certainly the first Godfather, but many other pictures I've made. I mean, it had a part in Las Vegas, it had a part in Lake Tahoe, it had a part in old New York in the 20s, it had a part in Sicily, it had a part in Cuba, all these places, and yet the production went smooth as it could be, and people who say that I can only make movies when I'm basically suffering and under the gun. Godfather Part 2 was not suffering and was not under the gun. So to me, that demonstrates that being scared out of your mind is not a necessary element to make a good picture. You know, subsequently, other movies I made that I didn't know how to make, I came to learn how to make them in the course of doing it, which is is my peculiar approach to cinema. I like to learn by not knowing how the hell to do it. And then I'm forced to discover how to do it, and with the great and most able collaborators, which I've always had, because I have had the good taste to choose colleagues who are so extraordinary as Vittorio Storaro and Dean Tavoularis and these wonderful actors who have been involved, and the great Marlon Brando. I mean, he was not just a great actor, he certainly was a great actor, a very unique kind of actor, and you talk to him in very different terms. You never talk to him about acting, but he was also a great man the way he thought about life, about termites, about people, about ants, about reality. I mean, he was, aside from his acting, a kind of a genius. I'm old enough now to say that I have met half dozen geniuses. I met Akira Kurosawa, I met Federico Fellini, but Brando was an extraordinary man, possibly number one on the list of geniuses I've had the honor and privilege to meet.
You always hear these interesting stories about him and being difficult to work with in the acting.
He wasn't difficult to work with, he just worked a different way. You didn't talk to him about acting or I think your motivation, blah, blah. You didn't talk about that. In fact, you didn't even have to talk to him. You could just put a prop in his hand and he would then use that prop to accomplish what you really wanted. Apocalypse Now. As I would have expected, I had no idea how to make this kind of film. And because of that, I had to learn on the job pretty fast. You know, making a movie is like running on a railroad track away from a locomotive coming at you. You cannot trip. You cannot fall. You're dead. You have to understand, I made Apocalypse Now right after I had won 5 Oscars and was probably one of the hottest young, if not the hottest young director in Hollywood. And absolutely nobody wanted to be in Apocalypse Now, and nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. So I own Apocalypse Now for one simple reason: nobody else wanted it. So I undertook making Apocalypse Now by basically agreeing to guaranteeing its cost, which was stupid, because making a film like that involves coordinating a lot of elements. 4 or 5 languages were spoken. We were in the Philippines. We had many scenes involving helicopters flying around, and we were in the helicopter shooting. That wasn't fake. It wasn't CG helicopters. It was real. Clearly, we did not know what we were really doing. I didn't. I was learning as I was going, and interest was at 27%. You think now they're going to talk about making interest, you know, your mortgage might be 4% or 5%. 27% on a dollar, which was rapidly building up as we were going over budget, all was on my shoulder. I had gone from the frying pan into the fire. I mean, Godfather was a tough shoot because they didn't like what I was doing and I had no power. Apocalypse Now was a very tough shoot for a whole bunch of other reasons that were out of my control, and I had my wife there, and you have that documentary, because I've always had a rule that if I'm going away for more than 10 days on a movie, I would take my kids out of school because I like my kids. I want them to be around. I want to see them. And also I want my wife there, but I had to do something that would be interesting to her. She just doesn't want to go off and be, quote, the wife. So I put a camera in her hand. She's a very talented handhold operator. And being my wife, when I would come home after the day and say, oh, this movie is a nightmare, I'm going to get an F for this movie, this is the worst movie ever made, I was hoping she would say, oh no, dear, it's going to be okay, you're going to make a great film. Instead, she would say, would you say that again, and put the microphone on?
It's like going to school. You finish your term paper, and maybe you get a B instead of an A+ that you wanted, so you get a B. And so
But I'm going to get an F. This film is a $20 million disaster. Why won't anyone believe me? I'm thinking of shooting myself.
All of this nightmare of not knowing what I was doing, being against outrageous odds, having changed the style of the movie, making it, as we went along, more surrealistic. Movies are made by many, many things and people, but one of the things that make a movie is the movie. It contributes to making itself. How does that work? Well, if you're throwing smoke grenades and you and the photographer and art director say, gee, that looks good, let's do more of that. That's what I mean by the movie starts nudging into you and saying, don't go this way, go more this way. So Apocalypse Now was sort of telling us to make the film be more surrealistic, that the journey up the river wasn't just a journey up the river towards Cambodia, that the journey was a journey through time, and we were going through time, and we would end up in the 50s when the French were there, and then we would end up 1,000 years before that when the earliest Homo sapiens were there in their most original form, which was these Montagnard natives who were the Ifugao people of Philippines. When the movie starts taking over and making it, when Brando arrived, he looked at me so smart and he said, he said, you painted yourself in a corner, didn't you? Meaning you had made this movie so surreal that a normal big movie war scene ending where the other guys come and they fight isn't going to work. If you've made the movie go in a very surreal direction, you're going to have to think of a resolution that is surreal, or that can at least have resonance without just being a typical, well, the army comes, there was a big battle, and it's an exciting battle, and then it's over. So there I was, having done this, on the hook for it. And I wouldn't even talk about other calamities, such as the typhoon destroying all the sets, or even a more human scare, which was Marty Sheen's heart attack, which, one thing about Marty Sheen is, of course, no doubt, his family loved him dearly, but everyone loved him. He was just an extremely nice person that everyone was scared. Had he had not survived, the people who were making the film would have closed down, and the money would have come from me for what had been spent, and I could never get it back because I'd have no finished film. So when I told everybody, don't gossip, don't call home and say Marty's had a heart attack, because I even am embarrassed with what I said in my wife's film, although I had the power to take it out, I didn't. But I had to.
If Marty dies, I want to hear that everything's okay until I say Marty is dead. You got it? Right. If it's not done, man, ship the whole office out of here.
The film only even managed to survive is because his wife courageously just took him to a hospital and didn't say he's out of the picture. And because of that, I kept shooting with his brother. And then eventually, thank God, he came back and was able to finish, and he's alive to this day, as we know. Many people said, gee, that movie is incredible, but I saw the rushes, and there's unbelievable stuff that never got in the picture. So I was encouraged to make a film version called Redux, which was like another, God knows what, 40 minutes longer, and it was successful. But the problem is that I felt, well, maybe it's true the first Apocalypse Now we left out a couple of important things like the French plantation, but Redux version, it had too much put back in it. So, I said, it's sort of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. This one was too much and this one was too little. So I tried to make a balance, which is called Final Cut, that still has the drive and the dynamics of the first one, but keeps a version of the French, because that was an interesting comment made that before there had been Americans had the Vietnamese War, it was a French war. The conversation.
I don't know what I'm going to get him for Christmas yet. He's already got everything.
Doesn't need anything anymore.
Well, I haven't decided what I'm going to get you yet.
I had loved the movie of Antonioni, Blow Up. I just thought, I want to make a movie like that. That's the kind of movie I want to make because it was intriguing and it was moving and it was mysterious. And I was talking to a wonderful filmmaker named Irvin Kershner about that. And I said, I wonder if nowadays, they can eavesdrop on you with these shotgun microphones where they can bounce light off the window pane and they can figure out what was being said inside. And he said, yeah, that's true. So I began to learn that. I was also interested in this idea that you make a movie in which repetition was an element. In other words, the same thing was being said over and over, but every time you heard it, it meant something a little different. And I was interested in experimenting with that.
He'd kill us if he got the chance.
We've always felt that sound is half the experience, that sound and picture are the two components, 50-50, that contribute to the effect on an audience. The interesting thing we knew was sound was much cheaper than picture. So in the early days of Zoetrope, we put all our energy into sound and in many ways created the modern soundtrack format which now dominates the world. That was all done in San Francisco because Zoetrope was here, George was here, meaning Walter Murch was here and his colleagues, but also Dolby was here. And through that friendly collaboration between us and Dolby came a standard that then got proliferated around the world. It was always appealing when a character is hoist on his own petard. In other words, Harry's punishment for his sins, be they real sins or not, is that he becomes obsessed, that he's being gazed into. And well, the reason he tears his room apart is looking for the bug which probably isn't even there, it's in his mind. The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone. I had no desire to make a second Godfather. I had no desire to make a third Godfather. I thought the first one was sufficient. But sometimes you are swimming in a sea where there are needs that you have to do, like feed your family, which you have to figure out how to negotiate. My feeling about the third movie was that it was a coda. In music, if you have a big piece of music and you have a coda, that's the summing up, the epilogue. Both Mario and I had agreed that the script would be a coda and it would be called The Death of Michael Corleone. Now, of course, by that time, the studio was much more interested in calling it The Godfather Part 3 because that could imply there being a Part 4 and a Part 5 and a Part 6, which really, it's not in that material, but you can make anything be in any material. At the time it came out on Christmas, so it came out in a pretty fast post-production period. We weren't really finished, but it came out and they wanted to be called The Godfather Part 3, and I didn't have the power that I had during Part 2, but I subsequently took a look at it and said, well, if I could do it the way I wanted and what Mario and I had agreed, I would call it The Death of Michael Corleone. And it would not be considered a third installment, but rather it would be considered the third resolution that would try to resolve the entire first two movies with a coda or an epilogue. And so that's when I had the opportunity. Paramount graciously gave me the chance to do what I wanted. And so I took the film and I recut it and made it a little shorter, in fact, and began it in a different place, ended it in a different place, and moved things around in a version that I thought was very superior to what had come out as Godfather Part 3. And so that's what is now going to come out on the 50th anniversary. It does the job that I had hoped and that Mario had hoped to do. You know, Mario that collaboration turned out to be like having a wonderful uncle, Mario Puzo. He was a real character, and we developed a nice working relationship, and I'm very fond of him and his memory. Megalopolis. You know, usually my projects are made in leapfrog fashion. What that means is that I'll be writing The Rain People, and I write and I write and I write, and then there comes a point where you have this enzyme secreted which makes you hate what you're writing. And then you eventually abandon it. You say, I hate it, it's no good. Then you start another one, and the same thing happens. You work on it, and then after a while you start to hate it. Then you abandon it, and you look at the other one that you had abandoned, and you think, you know, that wasn't so bad. And then you take it and you make it. So you're always making the one that you had just abandoned. And indeed, I was working on Megalopolis, which was going to be I figured I'm getting old now, and I've made movies in every style known to man. I've made movies in this style, and that style, and that style. I've learned all styles. Now I would like to find out what is my style. And I'm just going to slowly pick a subject matter that interests me and then write an original screenplay from that. And I did. I took notes, and I read a lot of stuff, and I became interested in a peculiar little wrinkle in Roman history, which is known as the Catiline Conspiracy. The Catiline Conspiracy really was a story of someone whose position was very classical and old, that the old traditions are good, which is so, you know, versus a conflict with someone who was more futurist, that we should leap over the old and into new ideas. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you made a Roman epic but didn't set it in ancient Rome, set it in modern New York, did a story, a big New York story, in which Catiline and a Cicero, or the mayor and an architect, were at odds. And what if there was a girl? What if it was the daughter of the mayor who came to be in love with the opponent of the mayor? So it could be I really wanted to make a love story. So I pieced together this sort of piece that would be a love story, which is I wanted to make so bad, a really heartbreaking, moving love story, but also a story of the debate between those who believed that the way to go is to leap into the future, and those who believe we should secure the security of the past. And I thought that would be something that I didn't know the answer to, but it would sure be worth working on, and if I might come to a position where I knew an answer for that question. Learning from the great Elia Kazan, I always try to have a word that is the core of what the movie is really about, in one word. For Godfather, the key word is succession. That's what the movie is about. Apocalypse Now, morality. The conversation, privacy. Megalopolis. You know what it is? Sincerity. That's the word I use when I say, what should I do? Okay, it's a future city. What is it like? Well, for sure, it has to be something that we all want to live in. If we come away like Lost Horizons, I don't, it's a little creepy. It all looks like a monastery or something. That's not going to work.
I think I can speak for a lot of people saying that we're really excited for Megalopolis 2.
Well, I'm starting now. I'm working on it now, in fact.